Yo, what's up guys, Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing a set review for March of the Machine Aftermath, which is the next set that's going to be releasing on Arena, and in this set review I'm going to be focused more on Historic and Explorer, and also Alchemy, because I do think there are a couple of cards that could have a big impact on the Alchemy meta as well. I haven't played Standard much at all until very recently, but I am learning the format right now, so I'm hoping soon, once I've got a better grasp on the format, I should have some Standard decks to bring you as well. But anyway, what I've done is, I've gone through all the set, and it's quite a small set, so there aren't that many cards, but what I've done is I've just gone through and picked out any cards that I think have likely to see play, mainly in Historic or Explorer, but also a couple for Alchemy as well. So let's just get straight into it. Starting off here with Nixilis Captive Kingpin. So this is a really interesting card for the Sacrifice decks. So I'm mainly excited for this in Explorer and Alchemy, but you know, it is powerful enough that it could potentially see play in the future in Historic, but I don't think there's really a good home for it right now. So the really nice thing about this card is it's very reminiscent of Corvold, in that it grows and produces a ton of card advantage as you just do your general game plan anyway. I think one of the biggest issues with Sacrifice decks in general, but specifically in Explorer right now, is that one of the weaknesses of the deck is that it just takes a long time to close the game out, right? You're very good at producing advantage, you're very good at, you know, taking over the battlefield, but you don't actually end the game that quickly, which means you can sometimes struggle against both control and combo decks. And having Nixilis as a card that really helps you to close games out a lot quicker, that also means, first of all, you don't have to splash into green for Corvold, and second of all, this being a mana cheaper is really huge as well. So in the Explorer Sacrifice decks, this triggers mainly off Cauldron Familiar and Mayhem Devil, but you know, there are a number of other cards that you could potentially run if you wanted to increase the number of things that this triggered, like Voldaren Epicure. You could even try a hybrid with only Cold Anvil and Cat Oven. Now, I'm not sure that's going to be better than the current Rakdos builds, but I definitely think it could see play there. Now, the current Rakdos Sacrifice builds in Explorer are pretty tight for space, but there are usually a couple of flex slots, and I definitely think that this has potential to see play there for sure. And then in Alchemy, I think this is going to be an absolute slam dunk in the Oni Cold Anvil decks there as well, because not only does this trigger off Oni Cold Anvil, but it also triggers off Voldaren Epicure, and both Blood Artist and the Bloods ping off Sanguine Brushstroke as well. So it's going to be very easy for you to trigger this. You also won't really need to run more than a couple of copies of this, because you can set up the deck so that Crucius can tutor for it if you discard a 3-drop and pick Ambitious. So definitely expect this to improve the Alchemy Oni Cold Anvil deck, and I could also see it seeing play in Explorer Sacrifice as well. In terms of Historic, since the Cauldron Familiar nerf, Sacrifice hasn't really been a viable deck for quite a while. Now, Oni Cold Anvil is still possible there, and a little while back I did have some success with a Jund Oni Cold Anvil deck using Crucius to tutor and ramp into Corvold. But the main reason I was interested in Corvold in that deck was because it doesn't die to Fatal Push, and one of the big weaknesses of Nixilis is that it is 4 mana, so it does die to Fatal Push, so I'm not sure this would be better in the Historic Oni Cold Anvil shell really, but down the line, if Sacrifice does somehow become more popular, or there are just a lot of cards that end up pinging the opponent in a red-black deck, this definitely has the power level to see play in Historic. But like I said, one of the big drawbacks of this card is it is vulnerable to removal, it dies to Fatal Push and Abrade, but I definitely think that it's powerful enough that it could definitely see play in the homes I mentioned. Next up, we've got Coppercoat Vanguard. So this is probably the card that I'm most excited for personally, because I think this is really big for the Humans deck in both Explorer and Historic. So 2 mana and gives each other human +1/+0 and Ward 1. The Ward 1 is the main thing I'm excited for on this. Obviously, +1/+0 is great in Humans because you're typically a go wide deck. So getting extra powers to your whole board is going to be great. But the Ward 1 is really interesting here because I think one of the main reasons that Humans hasn't really been that popular, specifically in Historic recently, is because of the presence of the Rakdos and the Jund mid-range decks that both have cards like, you know, Fatal Push and Molten Impact that, even though you do have Esper Sentinel and Thalia, is not too difficult for the opponent to pick apart your board, and giving your creatures Ward 1 really feels like it would help in those sorts of matchups for sure. And then in Explorer, you know, I think one of the worst matchups for Humans from my experience is the Rakdos Sacrifice deck because of, you know, Claim the Firstborn and Mayhem Devil and stuff like that. And similarly, again, there, giving your other humans Ward 1 is a big deal. Now, it doesn't give the Coppercoat Vanguard itself Ward 1, which does mean the opponent can just reuse removal on this and then remove the ward on the other creatures, but humans has such a high density of powerful threats that I definitely think this is going to improve the matchups against decks that rely on single target removal to interact with you. You know, specifically in Historic, I think Rakdos and Jund midrange are really going to struggle to beat curve outs where you go Esper Sentinel on turn 1 into Coppercoat Vanguard on 2, because not only does the Vanguard give Esper Sentinel Ward 1, 2/1. It also makes it a 2/1, so it buffs its power and makes it even more difficult for the opponent to pay the tax on it as well. So yeah, I'm really excited to play with this card. Non-legendary, so you can run 4 copies of it. Going to be really powerful in combination with Thalia's Lieutenant to boost your whole board as well. So I'm really excited to try this out, and I do think this could be a meaningful upgrade to humans, and could potentially bring it back in the meta game again in Historic, which is exciting. Speaking of humans, we also get another really nice addition to the humans tribe here. This is, it could potentially see play in the main deck as maybe a 1 or 2 of, but I think this is probably mainly as a sideboard card from my perspective. So the main thing I'm excited for on this card is the ability to give your humans hexproof and indestructible until the end of turn. So it kind of works like a slightly better selfless spirit, which is a really powerful effect because it basically protects your board. The main thing you're excited for with this is that it protects your board from destruction-based sweepers like Brotherhood's End and Supreme Verdict. So Jirina, in combination with Coppercoat Vanguard, gives you basically protection against everything, right? Coppercoat Vanguard is really good against spot removal. Jirina can also be good against spot removal, but you typically want to save it to protect against stuff like Supreme Verdict and Brotherhood's End. Now, I'm slightly less excited for this in Historic because obviously Divine Purge is still about, and I think that is probably the sweeper of choice in control decks right now from my experience, but I still think this could be good in Historic, specifically against decks that rely on Brotherhood's End, right? Rakdos Midrange is a good example of that. Post-sideboard, Brotherhood's End is going to be one of the better cards against you, and bringing this in as a way to protect your whole board from Brotherhood's End seems really big. And there are also just decent options to be in black, white, and humans as well. I think Juggernaut Peddler is a really solid sideboard card, potentially a main deck card in humans as well. And you also get stuff like General Kudrow as well. So I definitely think that a black, white humans deck, whether you want to go pure Orzhov, or maybe you could go Abzan for Collector's Company, or Mardu for Crucius maybe, this definitely seems like a great option. It also does have some incidental graveyard hate on it as well, which is really nice. If you do bring this in against Rakdos, being able to play this and then exile the opponent's graveyard so they can't play stuff off Jostle or exile their Croxus seems really nice, but I don't think you would want to run this as your main graveyard hate because it's sorcery speed and single use. So if you're up against a deck like Reanimator or whatever, they can fairly easily pitch a card to the graveyard and reanimate it in the same turn, or they can just wait for you to play Jirina and then fill their graveyard up afterwards. So I don't think you would run this for the graveyard hate, but having it incidentally is going to be really nice as well. So definitely a really great sideboard card for humans. Could potentially see play in the main deck as well, potentially. And then next up we've got Markov Baron. So this is a really interesting card for the Vampires tribe. Now Vampires hasn't really been a top tier deck in either Historic or Explorer really, but it does have some really strong cards. I think both Saurian Imperious Bloodlord and Cordial Vampire are incredibly powerful cards. It's just the rest of the deck doesn't really have a high enough density of good threats. And this seems like a really interesting card. A Lord that has both Convoke and Madness does seem very powerful. Now, in order to enable this, you probably will need to be running a deck with a ton of cheap creatures. You'd probably want to go pretty heavy on the 1-drop slot, which Vampires isn't that great at doing. I have built, oh, by the way, I forgot to say at the start of the video, but I'm going to link an article in the description, which is kind of like a text card review of these cards, but I've also thrown in some early Theorycraft deck lists if you're interested in that sort of thing. And one of the deck lists that I brewed for Markov Baron is an Orzhov Vampires deck that's running a lot of 1-drops like Legion's Landing, and also the other 2-mana Lord as well, so very low to the ground, so you can consistently convoke this out. And being able to convoke this out early is really powerful, right? It does incentivize you to be running a lot of 1-drops, but it's very powerful if you can go, 1-drop on turn 1, 2 1-drops on turn 2, and then immediately convoke this out, and then you're threatening a ton of damage the following turn. So I think white-black from the card pool we have at the moment is probably the preferred way to build this because of cards like Legion's Landing, but the fact that this has Madness does mean you could potentially look into running it in red-black instead, because you do get stuff like Voldaran Epicure and Bloodtithe Harvester, and also, I forgot the name of it now. There's another red 1-drop, Insolent Neonate, that's the name of it, that's also good at discarding, so could potentially work in red-black if you're interested in getting the Madness payoff as well. But this is, a very interesting card. You probably do have to build around it. And the other nice thing about Markov Baron as well is that I also think it works pretty nicely with Pylon, which I think is one of the better removal spells that we got from March of the Machines that hasn't really found a good home yet. So I'm definitely excited to try this out. Now, I'm not sure it's really going to be good enough to make Vampires a playable deck in either format, but it's definitely an interesting card and has a lot of potential. And next we've got Cosmic Rebirth. So this is another really interesting card for a number of reasons. I think, typically these sorts of effects that can reanimate, permanents that cost 1 to 3 are sorcery speed, right? We have Can't Stay Away and Recommission, which both see, a small amount of play in decks like Greasefang and stuff like that. But the fact that this is instant speed means that, first of all, you could use it as a combat trick, right? If you have a creature in the graveyard, the opponent attacks, at instant speed, you can just reanimate your creature as a blocker, which is, pretty nice upside. The other really nice thing about this is that it doesn't just reanimate creatures, you can reanimate non-creature permanents as well. So, if you're running a deck like Enchantress, you might be interested in this in the sideboard against interactive heavy decks like Rakdos Midrange, for example, as a way to bring back your Enchantress's presence and your Banishing Lights and other random enchantments like that. It can also reanimate Fable of the Mirror Breaker, which seems pretty good, right? So the main homes I'm thinking of that this could see play is either decks that have a mix of cheaper permanents that you would actively want to reanimate and more expensive permanents that you want to bring back to your hand. So, I'm not sure it would quite make the cut in a domain deck, but, it's a potential consideration if you're running a domain deck, because you can use this to reanimate your Territorial Carvus and Cruciuses and, Fable of the Mirror Breakers if you're running that. And you can also use it to bring back Leyline Bindings back to your hand as well. So that's, one potential home that it could see play in. And the other one, like I said, is probably decks that want to reanimate enchantments and planeswalkers, because I think if you're going to be reanimating creatures on this, you're probably better off running Can't Stay Away, for example. Greasefang is a good example of that, just because it's cheaper and it also has flashback, so it plays better in the Greasefang, self-mill game plan. And if you're trying to bring back artifacts from the graveyard, I think Recommission is better, again, because it's 1 mana cheaper. But if you're trying to reanimate enchantments or planeswalkers, this seems like a good fit as well. So I'm not sure this has a great fit straight away, but there are a number of upsides on this that, it could see play in a deck like Domain or potentially Enchantress as well. And obviously the incidental life gain is even further upside as well. So really interesting card. Not sure it has an immediate home, but definitely one that's on my radar for sure. Next up, we've got Goldforged Thopteryx. So this is a card that is mainly interesting to me, first of all, because it's a Thopter, so it could be a potential option in Retrofit Foundry decks and Historic. And it also gives your legendary permanents Ward 2 as well, which, I don't play much Standard, but this does seem like it could be potentially good in the Esper Legends deck there. Giving all of your legendary permanents Ward 2 seems really nice. And also, I have seen some Legend Matters decks in Alchemy as well, which could fit there as well. But in terms of Historic, which is the main home I'm thinking of for this, it is a Thopter, so, it is good with Retrofit Foundry. Typically in Retrofit Foundry decks, you want to run more than just the 4 Ornithopters to maximize those fast starts where you can get 4/4s down early. I think if this is to see play in a Retrofit Foundry deck, it would probably be in blue-white, because I think red generally has better options, right? I think I prefer the Yotia Declares War and Invasion of Kaladesh to this if you're in red, but in blue-white, the only real options you have for additional Thopters are Hope of Girapur, which is, reasonable but not amazing, and Barbed Spike, which has always felt kind of a bit meh to me as well, was basically like a necessary evil in the earlier builds of that deck. And this is another potential option, right? It does have some nice upsides. It's flying and lifelink, which is really nice against aggro if you pair it with Mashika's Reign of Truth or Ensoul Artifact, which is really nice. And it also gives your Lurrus Ward 2, which is nice upside as well. But, the drawbacks of this card is that it's just more expensive than other options, right? If you want flying and lifelink, you've got Vault Scourge at 1 mana. And if you're just after the Thopter, Hope of Girapur is a mana cheaper as well. So in terms of efficiency, I think there are better options. But if you are building the deck and you feel like you wanted a flying lifelinker to help against aggro, and you also felt like you didn't have enough Thopters in the deck to consistently enable Retrofit Foundry, then this is definitely a consideration there. And the fact that this gives Lurrus Ward 2 and, potentially like Skrelv if you're running that as well, is a nice upside, so it's definitely a consideration. And next up, we've got Narset Enlightened Exile. So this is a card that I'm mainly excited for in Explorer, mainly in decks that are running Young Pyromancer and Third Pass Iconoclast, which, those sort of decks have been around for a while, like the 8 Pyromancer decks, where you just run those cards and a bunch of cheap spells to be able to swarm the battlefield with tokens really quickly. That sort of deck also works really nicely with some of the new Convoke cards that we got from March of the Machine, like Meeting of Minds, I think is the name of it. And then since this incentivizes you to splash in white as well, you could potentially run this alongside Monastery Mentor as well. So you could run maybe 10 or even the full 12 token generators, which is really nice. Then once this is in play, it gives all of your creatures prowess. So obviously this is going to be great if you have a board full of tokens off your Pyromancer and Third Path Iconoclast. And the nice thing to note about this is that creatures can have prowess twice. So if you've made tokens off Monastery Mentor, for example, and then you play the Narset, it has prowess twice, so they'll grow even quicker. And then if you can untap with this and start attacking, it kind of works like a better Dreadhorde Arcanist, which is really powerful. The obvious massive weakness of this, though, is that it's a 4-mana creature that you have to untap with to get value off, which is, definitely a bit of a red flag. But, the reason I think this might be playable is because the home that I expected to see play in, kind of like these, 8 Pyromancer or maybe even 10 or 12 Pyromancer decks with Young Pyromancer, Third Path Iconoclast, and Monastery Mentor, is that all of the creatures in that deck are basically must-kill threats anyway, so there's a decent chance that by the time you cast Narset, the opponent might have already gone through all their removal, killing your earlier threats, so it does have a reasonable chance to live, but I'm not 100% sure this is really going to be that great, particularly against very interactive heavy decks like Rakdos Midrange or Rakdos Sacrifice, but it's definitely a card that I'm going to be trying out for sure. Next up, we've got Samut, Vizier of Naktamun. Not sure how you say that one, but this is an interesting card. It basically pays you off for having a ton of haste creatures in the deck. So, if you can connect the turn it comes down, it draws you a card, and then if you play any other haste creatures afterwards, it also draws you a card. So the main reason I was interested in this card is that I feel like it could potentially slot into Gruul Aggro in both Explorer and Historic. Now, Gruul Aggro hasn't really been a top deck in either of the formats for a while, mainly because it's just so one-dimensional, right? The whole game plan of that deck is play creatures out and just attack and hope that the opponent doesn't stabilize. If the opponent does stabilize against you, then you're kind of just left running out of gas a little bit. So the fact that this potentially produces card advantage is something that deck has lacked in the past. Now, you would have to build around this a little bit more heavily, I think. You would have to make sure you're running a very high density of haste creatures in order to get this to work. And the weakness of this card is that you only get the card draw if the creature that you play that turn attacks. So in a lot of spots, I imagine it's not going to be too difficult for the opponent to hold on to removal or hold blockers back to ensure that you don't get the card draw off this. But if you're under a lot of pressure, which the Gruul Aggro deck is typically good at doing, you might leave the opponent in a spot where they don't have a choice and they might have to, let you get the card advantage off it. Now, having said that, Ambergris is a card in Historic that kind of does a similar thing but a little bit more consistently, and that card hasn't really been good enough to make Gruul Aggro any better than it has been, but you could potentially run them both together, so it's definitely a card I'm excited to try out. Not 100% sure it's going to bring Gruul Aggro back in, but it's definitely an option that's worth trying, I think. Next up, we've got the first card that I'm mainly excited for in Alchemy, and this is Nahiri Forged in Fury. So this is a weird card because, in the older formats like Explorer and Historic, this pays you off for having a bunch of equipment in play, and there isn't really a deck in either format that does that. There are some equipment decks, right? In Historic specifically, we have the Nettlecyst decks, the bigger affinity decks, and we also obviously have Hammer Time as well. But those are decks that just run a few very impactful equipments. They don't really run that many. You need to be really running a high density of equipment for this to be worth it. But in Alchemy, we have the Boros equipment deck, which basically is doing that already, right? It has so many cheap equipments in. You've got Rabbit Battery and Inchblade Companion and a bunch of the Formiridon equipment that we got in the Alchemy set and in the main set as well. So this seems like a really great addition to that deck. It should be very easy to get the affinity online for this, to get this in play for cheap. And then as long as you have an equipped creature the turn this comes down, it immediately starts producing card advantage. So this seems like a card that is just going to completely run away with the game if the opponent can't deal with it. And I do think that Boros equipment deck is already pretty good. So I definitely think the two biggest winners out of this set, for Alchemy anyway, are going to be the Onicult Anvil deck because of Nixilis, and the Boros equipment deck because Nahiri seems like such a natural fit for that deck and seems like a really powerful card in that archetype as well. Next up, we've got another card that I'm mainly excited for in Alchemy, and that is Sarkhan, Solar Flame. So, this is a generically powerful card if you're running a Dragons deck in general, and because we got the new Invasion of Tarkir recently, which is, I think, one of the most generically powerful invasions, but you need to be running Dragons for it to really be worth it. So, in terms of Explorer and Historic, Dragons obviously isn't really a deck in either format. We did get the new Invasion, and there are obviously some powerful Dragons, so I could see this being pretty good with cards like Glorybringer and Goldspan Dragon, but I don't think that even with this and Invasion of Tarkir, it's really going to be good enough for Historic and Explorer. In terms of Alchemy, though, we do have a decent amount of Dragon support there, and Dragons has been a playable deck in the past, so, you could run this alongside Fearsome Whelp and Fable of the Mirror Breaker, and there are a couple of other options you can use to ramp into Dragons as well, and then you've got the Invasion of Tarkir, like I mentioned, and the what's it called? Dragon's Fire, the other removal spell. But the main card I'm really excited for this with is the new Zergo Dragon. I'll just bring that up actually, just in case you don't know what it is. So this is a card from the latest set, March of the Machine, Zergo and Ujitai, this is the one. And this card, the main thing about Sarkhan Solar Flame to really take advantage of this, obviously giving your dragons one less to cast, means that you can ramp into your 5 mana dragons on turn 4, but since it turns into a copy of it, you really ideally want to be running dragons that either get triggers when they attack, or get triggers when they deal damage, and Zergo and Ujitai seems like the perfect card. This curve out seems really strong, right? Sarkhan on turn 3, Zergo and Ujitai on turn 4, and then you get to attack with both the Zergo and the Sarkhan, which is copying it, and getting 2 triggers off it immediately. So this seems like a really nice curve out, and does seem like it could be a playable deck in Alchemy, right? The other awkward thing about Sarkhan Solar Flame and Alchemy is that I think most of the good dragon support is in Rakdos colors, so it is a little bit awkward. You probably would have to be like mono red, just splashing blue and white for Zergo, but I think this synergy is strong enough, and there are obviously a lot of good dragons in mono red as well, that you could just run basically a mono red dragons deck that's splashing blue and white for Sarkhan and Zergo, and then you'd obviously get access to stuff like counter spells in the sideboard as well, which is really nice. So I'm definitely excited to try this out in Alchemy. I don't think Dragons is a top tier deck at the moment, but you never know. This could be what that deck needed to push it back into the limelight again. Next up, we've got, now I'm kind of moving on to more fringe cards that are either sideboard cards or just cards to bear in mind for future. So starting off here with Spark Rupture, which is a really interesting effect that we've never had before. So this is basically a hate piece that just completely shuts off planeswalkers for as long as it's in play. And the fact that it replaces itself is really nice. 3 mana investment for this sort of thing isn't great typically, but the fact that it does replace itself is really nice. Now, in terms of the uses for it right now, in Historic and Explorer, the only 2 decks that you would really be interested in bringing this in against right now, it's definitely a sideboard card, you'd never main this, but the main 2 decks you'd be excited to bring this in for right now are either Control, because this shuts off, Teferi, as well as stuff like Wandering Emperor and Narset, and also Mono Green Devotion to shut off Khan and Kiora. Now, the thing I'm kind of skeptical about with this card is that in those sorts of matchups, if you wanted an effect that shuts off the Planeswalker, I think you'd much rather run Pithing Needle. Now, obviously, Pithing Needle only shuts off one Planeswalker, but in those 2 matchups, like I mentioned, I think Khan the Great Creator is the main thing you're worried about from Devotion, and Teferi is the main thing you're worried about from Control, and this being 2 mana more expensive is a real drawback. Against Control, being 3 mana is so much more vulnerable to counter spells. It's going to be really difficult to resolve this. Even if you're on the play, the opponent can have Censor, Dovin's Veto, and then if you're on the draw, they've got Archmage's Charm and all the other 3 mana counter spells. So this is much less reliable as a way to shut off Planeswalkers against Control. And then against Mono Green Devotion, a lot of decks need to be able to race there, or Devotion just typically goes over the top, and having to take 3 mana off rather than just 1 really limits your ability to curve out. So even in those matchups, I'm not sure you would run this over Pithing Needle, but it's definitely an option to bear in mind going forward in case a deck that runs a lot of Planeswalkers starts seeing play, because I think the main upside of this over something like Pithing Needle is if you're really interested in shutting off multiple different Planeswalkers. Speaking of which, I do think this could potentially see play maybe in Alchemy or Standard against like the mono white mid-range decks that are running a lot of Planeswalkers. But in general, I think this is probably a card that doesn't have a great home right now, but it's definitely worth bearing in mind going forwards in case there's like a Super Friends Planeswalker deck running a bunch of different Planeswalkers that you want to be able to shut down. And next up, we've got Metropolis Reformer. So this is an interesting card for the Angels tribe. I don't think you'd be interested in main decking this, but it does seem, a potential option in the sideboard, mainly because it gives you hexproof. So not only does it shut off combos that target you directly, like Goblin Charbelcher and Kethis combo if they're using Jace the Perfected Mind to try and mill you out, but it also shuts off burn spells and discard spells as well. Now, in terms of Historic, I'm not really sure this is going to see play or even going to be really worth it, because against Kethis combo, you're much better off using Graveyard Hate, especially if the opponent's using Jace Wielder of Mysteries. This just doesn't stop that at all. And Burn is already a really good matchup, so protecting from burn spells isn't really that great. And in terms of protecting against discard spells, you're mainly interested in protecting yourself from discard spells on turn 1 or 2. The fact that this is 3 mana probably means that it's too slow to really have that much of an impact against discard spells in general. So I'm not sure it's really going to be worth it in in Historic. I mean, in Explorer, where cards like Invoke Despair are a little bit more popular, then maybe this could be worth it there, potentially as a sideboard card against Rakdos midrange. Now, in general, I think I prefer Shaper's Sanctuary as a sideboard card for Angels against Rakdos midrange, but if you wanted to keep your creature count higher for Collected Company and Kyler's Reconstruction, and you expect to see a lot of cards like Invoke Despair, then this is definitely an option potentially in the sideboard there, but again, kind of more of like a fringe option than anything huge, to be honest. Then next up we've got Training Grounds. So again, this is a card that I think doesn't really have a great home right now, but it's definitely one bearing in mind going forwards, because for 1 mana it is a potentially powerful card. You know, it kind of reminds me of Omen Hawker a little bit from the last set, in that the effect is really powerful, but it just doesn't really feel like it has payoffs right now. You know, there are a number of creatures that this could work nicely with. You know, off the top of my head, you've got Knight of the Ebon Legion, which you could activate for 1 mana, but this seems like such a fringe card right now. It doesn't really feel like it's got any homes, and I can't really think of any applications straight away, but this is definitely a card to bear in mind as more cards are added to both formats for sure. And then next up we've got Reckless Handling. So this is another card that I don't really think is, you know, has great homes right now. I definitely think I'm more excited for this one in Explorer than Historic. So this is basically a tutor for any artifact, and then you discard a card at random. So, I mean, the main application that sprung to mind for me straight away is decks that want to put artifacts into the graveyard. So maybe like Greasefang, you could tutor up Parhelion, and then if you get lucky, you can discard it straight away. Or if you're running like a Trash for Treasure deck, and you want to put an artifact in the graveyard, or an Explorer, I guess if you're running like a refurbished deck, this could be good there. In Historic, this is basically not going to be useful at all unless you're specifically wanting to tutor an artifact to your hand to cast, because we have Goblin Engineer, which just is so much better than this card. In Explorer, you know, if you're really interested in trying to tutor an artifact, this could potentially be worth it, but, you know, I don't think it's worth trying to run Mardu Greasefang instead of Abzan for this card. So I think this is an interesting card that's worth mentioning, because we don't have a hard artifact tutor in either format right now. So there might be some deck in future that's really interested in this if your whole deck is built around a specific artifact. But right now, I think specifically in Historic, Goblin Engineer is so much better if you want to put artifacts in the graveyard. And in Explorer, there isn't really a deck that wants this right now, but one to bear in mind going forwards. Could be a potential option, you know, in future decks maybe. And then finally, we've got Sigarda, Font of Blessings. So this is another card that, you know, definitely feels strong and does a similar thing to Errant and Giada. So Errant and Giada from the latest set was a card that I was going to try and brew Angels with, because Angels has always been quite an inflexible deck if you're running Selesnya, because, you know, the real power of that deck lies in 4 Collected Company, 4 Kyler's Reconstruction, and the core of that Angels deck is kind of not very flexible at all, right? You have the Bishop of Wings and Giada and Righteous Valkyrie and Resplendent Angel that kind of makes up the core of that deck. So, but we have had a decent number of other Angels like Errant and Giada and this new Sigarda that could incentivize you to build the deck in a different way, right? You could run this alongside Errant and Giada and then just fill your deck with a bunch of Flying Angels and be able to play off the top, which is an interesting way to build the deck. Now, I don't really think that's going to be better than the Collected Company or Kyler's Reconstruction builds, to be honest, but it's definitely an interesting card. You could even run this in the sideboard of Selesnya Angels for, you know, matchups like Rakdos midrange, because it also gives all your other permanents hexproof, which is really nice against spot removal. And then, you know, get the upside of being able to cast Angels off the top of your library is really nice as well. So could potentially be a sideboard option, or you could try it in like a Ban Angels shell with Errant and Giada. But in order for this and Errant and Giada together to be good, you probably can't afford to be running cards like Bishop of Wings, which feels like a pretty big drawback as well. But it's definitely an interesting card that could incentivize you to build the Angels deck slightly differently. And if you are able to do that could help improve the matchup disparity, because the biggest weakness of Angels for a very long time now has been that you're really good against the aggro decks, but you kind of suck against control and combo. And being able to build a deck in a way where you can consistently play off the top of your library could give you, you know, an improved matchup against some of the more interactive decks as well. So definitely an interesting card, but I'm not really sure it's going to see play outside of maybe Angel's sideboard. So those are all the cards that I could, you know, think could see play. Like I said, it is quite a small set, you know, it's not a full set, and there are a lot of other cards in the set that I don't really think are going to have that much of an impact, especially in the older formats, but I do think there are some cards in here that could have a really big impact on certain archetypes. You know, Nixilis for Sacrifice. I think Humans get some really nice upgrades here as well. And then, yeah, some interesting options for other archetypes as well, you know, like the Nahiri for alchemy equipments as well. So I'm really excited to start bringing with some of these cards. Definitely let me know in the comments if you think I've missed anything, or if there are some applications of some of the cards that I mentioned that you thought of that I didn't mention as well. And also let me know what decks you're excited to build when the set drops next week. But anyway, yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you on the next one. Big up.